were to take a poll on our staff of who likes meetings the most, somewhere at the very, very bottom of that list, I don't know how many people we have total on our staff, but I would be at the bottom. Maybe. I don't want to mention any names or call anybody out of people who really love meetings, but I'm not one of those people. And so when I was in the meeting to plan this sermon series, we have our sermon planning team. We'll meet for a couple days. I'm planning like 6 months out. I don't know if I nodded off or if I stepped out to go to the bathroom, but I came back to a sermon series that we'd been working on that somebody had titled Like God. And I was like, what in the name of heresy have we planned here? Like God. Isn't that exactly what Satan got thrown out of heaven for doing? I'm going to, rise to the ranks and become like God. And just after they, calm me down, so, if you pay attention in meetings, you'd know that that's not what we're doing here. That this comes from the title we've pulled from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 22, that simply says this, says, put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. We're not trying to become God, but be like God in these very virtuous things. And that's fantastic. And I was like, okay, we can proceed with the deal. Not like you were going to stop because I told you to anyway. But that wasn't the first thing that came to my mind. That wasn't the first thing that I thought when I saw the title Like God, because I've read the Bible and it doesn't take you very long to find that phrase, and it's not a good thing when we see it. To become like God, we're going to dig into Adam's side of the story next week a little deeper. But do you remember what the serpent told Eve when she said, well, God has commanded that we not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We can have fruit from any other tree, and this is the tree that we're not supposed to eat of. And the serpent responds to her, you will not die. You will become like God. You'll be able to see, you'll see good and evil. You'll be like him in that way. And that's what God is trying to keep you from. And this actually kind of represents the story that we have told of ourselves from that point forward. And specifically talking about the roles of men and women together as we're looking at in this series. But before we turn our attention to the next 3 weeks of male godly role models, this week we're going to take a look at what happens when the two worlds of manhood and womanhood collide. And that's often how it's seen, right? A collision, like a car crash often, right? Because that's how our culture tells us it should be. The battle of the sexes. Who runs the world? Anybody? Girls. It's a Beyonce song, I've heard. Man versus, well, that's food, but anyway, if we take the world's view of masculinity and femininity, and it becomes a race to lord over one another, to become like God, to act like gods over the other gender. And toxic masculinity and extreme feminism have taken over the narratives in our culture. That's why we sat as a group and we were like, what are the felt needs of our culture? What are the felt needs of our community and our church? And this came to the forefront. And toxic masculinity has its playbook. You can probably rattle them off. Be an alpha, sleep around, chase women, treat them like their property. Be stoic and self-sufficient. Show no emotion. Sculpt a six-pack. Drink a six-pack or more. Be the breadwinner. Don't cry. Don't apologize. And don't you ever, 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 ever wear skinny jeans. Can I just, for a second here. These are not jeans. They're like stretchy something. I don't know. But can I just say, I always found this really funny with the skinny jeans thing. I'm not trying to defend skinny jeans, but I will say that the men that I've seen with the tightest jeans ever are cowboys that do work out in the fields, right? And you're like, well, you've never seen a baggy pair of Wranglers on a cowboy, right? I'm just saying, I just leave that out there. Boot cut maybe, all right, but not baggy. But this is what the manosphere defines manhood as. Of course, there are two sides to this coin. Buckle up. Toxic femininity is described with stereotypes as well, throwing all modesty and humility out the window, hyper-focused on outward appearance, use your body to get what you want, believing that men are a net negative on society. Do you remember that thing, like it'd rather be in the woods with a bear than a man? You remember that kind of made its way through the internet? Shouting out things like chivalry is dead, but chivalry should have died because you don't need a dragon to be slayed or a door to be held. I remember going into Walmart. Well, it wasn't Walmart. Those doors open themselves now. But I was going somewhere, and I stopped to hold the door open for a woman, and she just stopped dead in her tracks. And she was like, I don't need a man to hold the door open for me. So I closed the door, and I locked it, and I just like, I did. I was like, okay, that's fine. But the extremes in our culture are not working. The world tells us that men and women are to be in competition. Worldly masculinity demands dominance, and worldly feminism demands extreme independence. And both ends of the extreme bite the apple, believing that the serpent's lie, that the goal is to become like God, to rule over the other. But the gospel paints us a radically different picture. Men and women are co-laborers in the kingdom of God. And it hurts the kingdom when we decide that we're not together in this work. And so as we turn our eyes to the pages of the New Testament, we start to see that the way of Jesus is spreading. When we look to the book of Acts and we see all the ways that it's infiltrating culture. And it's men and women working side by side, taking it to the ends of the earth. And we know the stories, we tend to know the stories of the men in the New Testament. They kind of get centered in that culture. But the inclusion of and the elevation of women in the first century, this was really seen as radical. Just look to the ministry of Jesus where you see it all kind of start. Jesus stops a crowd to pay attention to a woman who was deemed unclean by the law. To say, who touched me? And he stops the entire crowd to focus on this woman. We see the story of the woman at the well in John. That he sits with this woman, and to the surprise of the men who follow Jesus, like, what is he doing talking to this woman? Or like, weren't we going out to get something to eat? Like, everything kind of like shifts in their mind. Remember Mary Magdalene, who is a faithful disciple of Jesus. We see her throughout his ministry. One of the last people on earth to see Jesus' lifeless body. And one of the first to see his resurrected body. She's often called the apostle to the apostles because she delivered the news that Jesus was alive to the 11 disciples. Paul mentions in his letters 15 co-laboring, gospel-sharing women in the 13 letters of our New Testament. And Paul entrusted his deepest theology, something we went through just a few series ago, the book of Romans. She hand-delivered and probably read the book of Romans to the Roman churches. Her name was Phoebe. We often assume in the first century it was men out doing the ministry stuff while the women were home like these ancient trad wives baking sourdough or something like that. But what we see in the New Testament is that's not the case. Also, shock value here is that most of the churches in the New Testament were happening in the homes. So who do you think's managing the home? We would call that an executive pastor today. It's the women of the homes. The real story of the New Testament and the spread of the gospel is radical collaboration. Women and men working side by side to carry out the Great Commission, using spiritual gifts which are not assigned by gender. If you go read that, Paul doesn't say, and to the women you get these gifts, and to the men you get these gifts. But going side by side, planting churches, sharing the gospel, making disciples together. Paul's favorite word for ministry partners in his epistles was this word synergos. Synergos, really fun to say. Also, really great coffee shop in Louisville if you're ever in town. Christian coffee shops get all the best Greek words. With like synergos, that's awesome. Like, what does this mean? But what it means is co-laborers, fellow worker. He uses it about a dozen times in the epistles. But perhaps nowhere is that spirit found more vivid than this working together couple in the lives of this couple that we're going to dig into today. They're only mentioned 5 times in the New Testament, but their footprint in the early church is massive. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. Now, if you know the book of Acts, you will know that, if you just know Numbers, the book of Acts, chapter 18 comes after everybody. chapter 17. Okay, good job. That's the math for the day. Paul has just delivered in chapter 17 one of his most famous sermons at the Areopagus. He's like all of these intellectual dudes are around, and he comes in and he gives this, introduces them to the God that they have no name for. It's unknown God, and he has this like beautiful sermon. People are curious. There's a little bit of fruit there in Athens. Some people who would go on to continue the church there. But Paul doesn't stay in Athens much longer after that. He moves on from the intellectual hub of Athens to the trade city of Corinth. And he's about to meet his most vital synagogue partners. Their names are Priscilla and Aquila. Look at Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. After this, Paul, left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them, and since they were the same occupation, tent making by trade, he stayed with them and worked. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both Jews and Greeks. This is actually the only time that we see their names in the New Testament mentioned in this order. There was a Jew named Aquila and his wife Priscilla. Actually, a little later in this chapter, they'll see them mentioned again, but it's not Aquila and his wife Priscilla, it's Priscilla and Aquila. And that's how I learned it. I just, kind of rolls off the tongue because we learned in Sunday school about Priscilla and Aquila, this co-laboring gospel couple. Some scholars think that Aquila may have been a servant to a wealthy Roman family, mentioned being in Italy. And they think that maybe even once he was freed, he was then able to pursue and marry someone of a Roman citizen. She's mentioned in other places in the Bible as Prisca, which was the Roman version of her name, or the Greek version of her name, and we know her as Priscilla. But we do know that they were an interracial couple, Aquila being a Jewish man, Priscilla being a Greek. She was likely of higher prominence in society, and thus her name was being mentioned, first. But it's also possible that she just took on a larger role in the church. So Luke, when he's writing the book of Acts, he just knew her more closely, and her name popped in his head first. You probably have couples like this, where it's not like the guy's name is always first or the girl's name is always first, like my brother and sister-in-law. I call them Jess and Seth because I knew her first. Maybe that's what it is. I think sometimes we can let the cultural narrative go. It's like, oh, let's read into this text. It's like she's mentioned first, so this means something. It could have just been maybe Luke just liked her more. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Aquila may not have been a good time to be around. I don't know. Don't read into it. But in the first century, we know that it kind of didn't matter for this couple. Paul finds them in Corinth. This is what's important, is they're going to work side by side because they were forced to leave Rome, Christians and Jews, causing a lot of riots in Rome. So Claudius decided, hey, you all have to leave. Everybody has to leave. And so Paul is traveling from city to city. He has no Airbnb that he can check into. He finds a room in their home because they're literal co-workers. They have the same trade. They do the same thing. The text says tent makers, and that was essentially kind of like an elaborate sleeping bag, like leather sleeping bags for shepherds who would sleep out in the fields with their sheep. And Priscilla and Aquila have no idea what God is about to do in their city through this man, Paul. They won't just be making these leather sleeping bags with Paul, but they're about to become a gospel power couple. But you've kind of got to follow them through the story. They don't stay with Paul all the time, and you kind of got to watch to see when they pop up. But let's not gloss over the fact that they were in Corinth because they were forced to be in Corinth. They didn't pull out an atlas and say, like, where do we want to vacation this summer? They didn't go like, well, we feel called into mission, so like, where would be a good place to land? They were forced to leave. They fled persecution and landed in God's plan. It's likely that Priscilla had to make a choice between her family and her husband and her status and where she was going to live, because they didn't have a choice where they were going, but they had a choice what they were doing when they got there. And so when they arrive in Corinth, they're on mission from the moment their feet hit the ground. So I want you to hang on to this. We'll come to more practical applications towards the end, but you may not be where you want to be in God's plan, and maybe you got a lot of questions about what that is for your life, but you have a choice of what you are doing there. What are you doing where you are now? The next time we see Priscilla and Aquila show up in the New Testament is actually just a few verses later. A lot happens in those verses, so we'll pick up in verse 18. After staying for some time, Paul said farewell to the brothers and sisters and sailed away to Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there. Thanks, Paul. But he himself entered the synagogue and debated with the Jews. Then he asked, when they asked him to stay a little longer, he declined. He said, farewell, I'll come back to you again if God's wills. Then he set sail for Ephesus. So Paul picks up these ministry partners. He says, you're going to come with me. Like, come with me to Ephesus. There's some really cool stuff going on there. We're going to start a church in Ephesus. And so he goes and he go to Ephesus and they do some really good work there. And then Paul's like, all right, I'm going to go off from here. I'm going to leave here. And they're like, so I guess we live in Ephesus now. Hey, Paul, remember the couple that you brought with you, your ministry partners? He's like, oh yeah, Priscilla and Aquila, they live in Ephesus now. So history tells us that they would be the early pillars in the church of Ephesus. They immediately become disciple makers in their new city. Look at verse 24. They have an opportunity. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandrium, an eloquent man who was competent in his use of the scriptures, arrived in Ephesus. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately about Jesus, although he only knew about John's baptism. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. After Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. If you'll remember from our Corinthian series, when Paul opens his letter to the Corinthians, which will be written later, we'll get there. The Corinthians are bragging and arguing about who baptized them and who discipled them, and Apollos is one of the names. This is Apollos' origin story. It seems like he was a disciple of John. He knew about baptism, but John's baptism. So he shows up in Ephesus. He realized something's going on and popping off there. He starts preaching about Jesus. He can preach a mean Jesus sermon, but he doesn't know about Jesus' baptism. He doesn't know about maybe the rest of the story, really kind of how this all connects to the greater scheme of the Jewish history and what God is doing moving forward. I like to kind of compare him to a TikTok preacher. Like he's got really suave, great words to say, and it would like catch your attention, and it's like, oh, that's really, really great. And you're like, wait, that may not be in the Bible, but it's possible. And so he knows just enough to be dangerous, right? He was unpolished in his theology. So Priscilla and Aquila, they take him in. They're very, very hospitable people. They invite him over for dinner, and it doesn't seem like this was a one-time thing. They mentored him. I don't think you just come over one time. He's like, we're going to explain everything about theology and God to you, then we're going to turn you loose. No, this was a relationship they had. They took him under their wing. You see, they're not threatened because he was some young, fiery preacher popping off in Ephesus. They didn't dismiss him because he wasn't preaching perfectly. Like, wow, leave it to the grown-ups. They offered him help to raise him up, to disciple him, to build up, to invest, and then send out this preacher. I think as a church we can stumble over this one when we see a young generation coming up with fire. We refuse to see the next generation as a threat. That's the piece that we've really got to embody as a multi-generational disciple-making church. Young people are flooding back to churches. And it's not because we have better lights or better sound or better video or anything like that, because they can find all of that perfectly curated in their pockets every day. But what young people are coming back looking for is authenticity, integrity. I would even call it goofy, old-fashioned, uncool people. Any volunteers? Okay. We're going to start a ministry called Goofy, Old-Fashioned, Uncool People that just genuinely care. That's a caveat, all right? You do have to care. Acts chapter 18, verse 27. When Apollos wanted to cross over into Achaia, the brothers and sisters wrote to the disciples to welcome him. After he arrived, he was a great help to those who had grace and believed. Notice the pattern for this couple. Notice the pattern for the early church. They engage Apollos. They don't push him away. They don't shove him down to be like, no, that's not acceptable. They correct his theology. They help him out to understand the ways of God more thoroughly. They encourage him. They write letters to the other disciples and go, hey, this guy is great. You guys should, he wants to come to you. You should accept him. And then they release him. They don't shrink back when the next move of God arrives. You don't retire from church. They didn't say, the next thing came, so we'll let it go and we'll just fade into the background. Paul would actually come back to Ephesus after a few years on his third missionary journey. If you have the Bible, like the maps in the back of your Bible, you can see Paul's third missionary journey. He comes back to Ephesus, and when he arrives in Ephesus, he finds this couple still in Ephesus, still leading a house church. He writes about them in 1 Corinthians, you might remember from our series, but he writes in chapter 16, verse 19, the churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla send your greetings warmly in the Lord, along with the church that meets in their home. So everywhere they lived, they started a church in their home. They opened their home to the church. It's almost like they were completely committed to this thing. It's like, hey, we're here. This is what we're doing. How does the church need us? Paul mentions them again in Romans, the last chapter of Romans, this letter he writes from Corinth. Once he gets to Corinth, they're no longer in Corinth. He says, give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, or to Prisca and Aquila. Remember, he's writing back to Rome. He's writing to Rome, so he uses her Roman name, Prisca and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ who risk their own necks for my life. Not only do I thank them, but I do so but so do all the Gentile churches. So by the time Paul writes the book of Romans, the Emperor Claudius has died. Priscilla and Aquila are allowed to move back to Rome, and Paul knows exactly where to find them. If they're in Rome, greet the house church that meets in their house. I know it exists. They are absolute rock stars in the early church. Now, if you were a pastor and you were starting a new church, and Priscilla and Aquila walked into your door, this is the type of couple that, like, they just moved from out of town, but their pastor has already called you, and not to say, hey, by the way, you got this guy Aquila showing up. You better watch out for him. He's going to try to become an elder, and he's going to try to burn your church to the ground. He's not that kind of guy, right? They're power hungry. They're jealous. They're going to want their way or the highway type of a thing. No, the pastor would call ahead, and they go like, make sure they don't go to the church down the street. These are rock stars. Put them at the front door. Put them in the nursery. Give them work, because they are there for you to be co-laborers. They walk into the lobby, and there's already a buzz around them. But their reputation wasn't just built on being a nice couple who attended church regularly, who served regularly. Paul commends them for something much heavier. He says, they risk their own necks for my life. Literally in the text, they put their lives on the line for my life. We don't know exactly what Paul is talking about here, if it was like just a one day when he was like, I remember that time when I thought we were going to die and there was Priscilla and Aquila. They risked their lives for me. Or if this was just kind of their posture over the course of their ministry life, like they have been putting their necks on the line for Paul. It could have been the riots in Corinth or the uprising in Ephesus, but the context is clear. When a mob came for Paul, when pressure came against Paul, this couple stepped in front. They were bold. They were sacrificial. They were hardworking co-laborers in the gospel. They didn't just share Paul's faith, they shared in his danger. And the final place that we see them in the New Testament is 2 Timothy. Paul is writing essentially on his deathbed. He's awaiting trial, but some scholars don't even know that if he made it to that trial, that he died under house arrest there in Rome. He writes from prison. He writes to a young pastor in Ephesus. Ever heard of it? He writes to this young pastor in Ephesus named Timothy. And Paul gives his last words at the end of 2 Timothy. It's just kind of all the things that he wants to say, that he's being poured out like a drink offering. And then he goes into this one little part where he's talking about all the people that have abandoned him. And it's all these names and all of the, like everybody, when my trial came up, everybody left me. I'm here by myself. This is the last leg. I'm coming around the last corner. My race is almost done. And then he starts listing names of people that abandoned him, but then he's also telling Timothy as a young pastor, hey, there's some people you really need to watch out for. And he lists off some names of watch out for that guy, watch out for that guy. He's giving me a lot of trouble, watch out for that guy. And then he turns the page and he writes, greet Priscilla and Aquila. Finally, this is the people who he wants to talk to. Now wait, they were in Rome? No, they're back in Ephesus. By this point, we shouldn't be surprised. At some point, Priscilla and Aquila move from Rome. They leave their life that they went back to, the place where they always wanted to be in the first place. They leave that to go back to Ephesus, this place where they've had so much ministry success and have been so involved. They don't get a map in our Bible, but if there was one, it would look kind of like this. This. We don't have a map. We ain't got a map. Okay. They don't get a map today or in your Bible. So that's on me. I think I did that. That's my fault. But if you think about the context of it, it's just a map with a bunch of arrows. It's a lot. They were all over the place. Okay? Kind of opposite of Paul and then with Paul and all of these different connecting points. Who better to be encouraging a young pastor in a young church, building them up, hosting, disciple-making, encouraging. Everywhere they went, they served. They followed God's lead. They built up believers. You could put this couple on the moon and they would open a house church somewhere. Faithful together on mission. Priscilla and Aquila represented the beauty of gospel cooperation. Collaboration together. They didn't fight for status or buy into the lies that pit men and women against each other. They simply build the kingdom together. And this spirit of partnership is not just reserved for people who get married and go do ministry work together. I always say in weddings when I do, it's like, you're not just marriage partners today, you're ministry partners. But it's not just reserved for the married. It's a mandate for every believer. Whether you're single or wed, the call to live on mission remains the same, to help move from inspiration to action today. I want to give us just some practicals to kind of, what do we do with this story? We see this couple kind of jet set all over across the New Testament. They're opening their home to house churches. They're hospitable. They're all this sort of stuff. And we can just look at them as role models. What can we do with that in the 21st century? Okay? Maybe God is calling you to go somewhere else, to pack up and go and to, be hospitable in another culture. But what are some today tangible suitcase things that we can take? Here's the first one that I think we can pull from that story. See your obstacles as an opportunity. You go back to the beginning of that story, Priscilla and Aquila were forced out of Rome. They turned that obstacle into an opportunity. They took the talents that God had given them and the place that God had placed them, and they worked a trade and worked alongside Paul spreading the gospel. They're like, well, we live in Rome now. What help? We don't live in Rome anymore. We don't have kind of the fallback of her family or whatever it was. Now we're here in Corinth. What can we do? So they start a business and they start making tents, and then Paul comes along and they're making tents. There are 1,000 reasons in this room why you may feel like you can't do this because of the obstacles in your life are just too big. Our house is not big enough to host a small group. We live on the wrong side of the town. I'm too old to serve. I'm too young to make a difference. Our kids are involved in too much. So we can start rattling off all of the excuses, and we can make a really, really long list. And this is not a you need perfect attendance at the church type of a suggestion. Life happens, weekend trips. I know that oftentimes we kind of just see like, well, as long as I'm just here every single week, like that's what's important. But entering into the work, I know that many of you only have so many days off, and sometimes it's during the Sunday service. You got to work. But what we see in this couple that goes from Rome to Corinth to Ephesus to Rome and back to Ephesus, we see this co-laboring couple. They made it work. They had no idea where they were going to be called or what God wanted them to do in that space. But they were forced there, they were called there, they were left there, they were stranded there. But they did know what they could do when they got there. They were going to advance the kingdom. They were going to be where they were in their life to advance the kingdom. But God specializes in turning obstacles into opportunity. Paul, from a prison cell, turns an opportunity to share the gospel with the whole of the guards. And so we may need to get a little bit creative. Think about your job, your position. What are the excuses that we keep coming up with? I thought of just a few, maybe things that come up for you. Over-the-road truckers. I was driving this week, and I was thinking, man, How hard would it be to engage in ministry when you don't know if you're going to be there on a Sunday morning, you don't know if you're going to, your rhythms are kind of determined by the job, but you have hours of opportunity to be a prayer warrior and to talk to people on the phone in need and to engage in that way. Maybe you travel a lot for work. What keeps you from dropping into a random local church and encouraging the Timothy that is there and the pastor or the staff? Say, hey, I'm not going to be here for very long, but how can I help you? How can I pray for you? Maybe you're not a people person. Large crowds, big groups, not your thing. You have an opportunity to be a one-on-one mentor. Listening, sending intentional texts and emails of encouragement, behind-the-scenes stuff that really does make a difference. Maybe you work the night shift. You might not make it to church on Sunday mornings every single week, but you also might be the only Christian presence at 2 a.m. in the break room on the night shift, a light to someone in their darkest moment. If you're an empty nester, you may have already thought of all the reasons. You may feel like you're out of the loop, you're too old to help. You also might feel like the closest thing to a parent or a grandparent that someone in our youth group could experience. Like I said, old, goofy. We're looking for that. Priscilla and Aquila didn't wait for a ministry position to open up that perfectly fit their schedules and their gifts. They saw Paul and they said, how can we help him spread the gospel? We need to leave. We need to go somewhere else. Let's go. We need to stay here. We'll stay. They saw that Paul, they said, how can we help? They saw Apollos and they said, how can we help this raw passion become a force for the kingdom of God? Which is the second. I think this is the second practical. We have to refuse to see the next move of God as a threat. Refuse to see the next move of God as a threat. And I'll be honest, I struggle with this one the most. This is why it's way down in the bottom of the sermon, because I really didn't want to write this. After 20 years of college ministry and youth ministry, I've officially entered my, what do we call it? Get off my lawn era. I think you know what I mean, right? I've entered this, I'm the guy screaming at clouds now, right? I'm like, that's not what the Bible says, I'm in the YouTube comments that nobody reads, but I'm in there, right? And we're like, well, actually this text, and actually that, no, you're doing it wrong. Nobody, that's really where I've become, So when I see young, up and coming preachers, someone who's younger than me, and sometimes they're way younger than I think they are. I was like, oh, this guy's a couple years behind me. He's like, no, 20 years younger than me. That's the people who have TikTok, by the way. But I'm looking, I was like, man, I'm looking and going, oh, yes, I can't even listen to this or whatever. It's just too much. They're always just they're all out for clicks. They're all whatever. And if I'm really honest with myself, I'm like, that's actually a pretty good point he made. I kind of wish I could pull off that shirt. But I see this and it wells up inside me. I'm like, yeah, get off my lawn. I cross my arms, roll my eyes, shout stuff from the back, My first instinct is not to be like Priscilla and Aquila and to see the raw passion and to see what Apollos could do for the kingdom of God and to go, I'm going to step into this. And if I'm really honest with myself, I have been to kind of dig into this sermon, but I'll share with you here. It's because I'm terrified. I'm insecure. I've been told, and I think sometimes our church culture would have people believe that as they grow older, that you're going to be forgotten, or you're going to be left behind. That the next move of God will not include me, that it's all about youth and it's all about, it's all about the next thing, and I just need to kind of fade into the back and be okay with whatever happens. And it's easier to sit back and to criticize the fire of the next generation than it is for me to help them tend the flame. I'd rather be known in my spirit. I'm proud. I'd rather be known for perfect theology than for venerable transitions. And then to admit that I'm no longer the one center stage, to push someone else out there to say, hey, what do you need? Do you need me to write a letter? Do you need a letter of recommendation as you're headed off to ministry school? Do you need me to, write a letter of recommendation to that church that you're headed to go be, to be an intern? Or what do you need from me? And here's the hard truth, church, that I think we need to look in the mirror and say, is that the only way to guarantee that you aren't part of what God is doing next is to not participate at all. Is to just retire. We don't retire from church. Priscilla and Aquila didn't just watch history happen, they invited it into their home. They welcomed what God was doing through Apollos and the next move of God. I'm reminded of the warning in the book of Amos when God told Israel, he said to them, it was a warning. He's like, I raised up Nazarites from among your youth, young people with fire in their bones and a radical devotion to me. And do you know what the mature, seasoned, perfect theology generation did? Do you know what they did? Tale as old as time. They didn't celebrate it. They didn't mentor them. They actually commanded the Nazarites to drink wine, which is a big thing that Nazarites don't do. It's kind of one of the things. They didn't mentor them. They didn't celebrate them. They actually commanded them to stop speaking. Quit being so loud. We've got a youth service for that. Go be loud over there. This is big church. We try to make the next generation drink the wine of our cynicism. We tell them, tone it down, wait your turn. That's not how we do things. You can have the stage when I'm dead. That's the kind of vibe we put off. I remember one of my mentors, I remember many of my mentors who watched me butcher sermons. Many of you have seen that as well recently. I remember the organ and the piano players who were watching me learn how to play the guitar during church service. They're like, you think we used to play songs slow, like hymns really, really dragging and slow? We were really dragging back at Houston First Christian Church because they were waiting for me to get my fingers in the right spot so I could play a G chord, right? They played slower and they told me I did a good job. I did not do a good job. The platforms that I've stood on are built on the shoulders of gospel-powered men and women who patiently, humbly, and encouragingly lifted me up. Remember the process for Priscilla and Aquila. They engaged Apollos. They corrected Apollos. They encouraged him. Where do you want to go? We'll send the letters. And then they released. I can just think, I wrote down a bunch of names. John and Kathleen, Don and Kathy, Sydney Ann, Jeff and Jenny, Alicia and Brad, Kristen and Les, Bruce and Brenda. Or is it Brenda and Bruce? I'll ask them later. Joyce and Dave, Sherry and Dana, Chad and Michelle, Faith and Joe Bob, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Men and women who refused to let the next generation be a threat. And they looked at me and they said, that was cute. Keep going. They looked at me and they go, you're getting better. They looked at me and literally said to me, every time you preach, you get a little better. And I was like, okay, like that's real stuff. It takes humility, it takes sacrifice, which is the last, I think, point we can stick in our suitcase and take today, is that take a humble posture of sacrifice. What can we learn from Priscilla and Aquila? They weren't just business partners with Paul. They risked their necks for him. They were co-laboring for the gospel. It's more than just sharing a cubicle or a tax bracket with somebody. It's about the shift and the why you do what you do. I've had a lot of conversation with roofers lately. Anybody else? Even the conversations you don't want to have. You're like, I need a new roof, but I don't want to talk to you. And I've realized there's a massive difference between a Christian company and a Christian running a company. Often one is just a fish on a business card or a slogan on a truck, but a Christian running a company, that's a co-laborer. I know many of you in this room aspire to that's your goal, to be a Christian running a company, a co-laborer. When you're a co-laborer, your trade funds the mission. Your skills are not yours to hoard. Your money is not your money. It all belongs to God. Your business is not about the bottom line, but it's a platform for the neck risking. Co-laboring means your success is no longer about your name, but about his name. Priscilla and Aquila weren't trying to make a tent-making empire. They were building the kingdom. When Paul was in trouble, they didn't check to see if moving again would affect their bottom line or interfere with their life and the map that they had set out for themselves. They put their necks on the line. They understood the greatest use of their life, their business, their safety. It was to spend it on the gospel. Everything they had, spend it on the gospel. And so when everything is said and done, young or old, if you're asked what you did with your time, your talent, your treasures, your testimony, to be able to say, I spent it on the gospel, that's a worthy tombstone refrain. That's a tattoo if you're into that sort of thing. Spend it on the gospel. The world tells us that to be like God means to be at the top of the food chain, to dominate, to be the alpha, to not need anyone. But the ultimate example of Jesus, the Son of God, who didn't come to be served, but to serve. He didn't come to dominate. He came to co-labor with us. He laid down his life. He risked his neck so that we could be brought into the family. Maybe you feel too old or too tired or too busy. Maybe you've been sitting in the back row, crossing your arms and shouting at the next generation to get off your lawn. Today is the day to uncross the arms. Today is the day to open your home, to leverage your job, your money, to step into the next move of God. We don't need more men and women competing for the crown. We need more men and women co-laboring for the kingdom. This church needs men and women co-laboring for the kingdom. This city needs gospel-powered couples to spend it all on the gospel. And so no matter where we find ourselves this morning, let's be people who champion the next generation. No matter where God places us, he has a work for us. Let's champion the next generation and risk our necks for the gospel of Jesus Christ. This morning, if you'd like to have a conversation about what it looks like to put your faith and trust in Jesus for the very first time, I'll be at Decision Point here as we're singing these last couple songs. Our prayer team will also be down on the wings on the side. If you'd like to just step out, have a conversation, have them pray over you. You don't even have to say anything. If you just walk over there and stand, their job is to just pray. They'll do it. But I'm going to have us all stand here this morning. And as we sing these last few songs, to think about what it looks like for men and women side by side, hand in hand, using time, talents, treasures, and testimonies to shape this church, to shape this community for the kingdom, to spend it all for the gospel, to take every asset that we have and lay it all out for the good of the kingdom. Let's worship.